let's just start. So basically, I'm with the Asian A.V Club. We love to do profiles of filmmakers. We love docs. So you've like hit multiple quadrants because we have Hong Kong in common. I love docs, all that fun stuff. So thank you for doing this. And
No.
and for for all intents and purposes, it's like we love to kind of know where you came from, like basically your origin story. We love a good superhero origin story. And so if you can tell us a little bit about what was it growing up in a place like Hong Kong that kind of really, I don't know, did your family watch a lot of movies? Like, what was the thing about this kind of form of storytelling that was kind of appealing to you that made you want to then go to Tisch and all that stuff, like moving forward as you kind of got older?
Yeah, my family, yeah, they've always watched movies, but in a way they consumed them as entertainment. Like my dad watches like 360 movies a year, but
Wow.
he won't be able to recall any of them because he's just watching them before he goes to bed. But I always loved watching movies like throughout middle school and high school and like going to Movie Land in Happy Valley, which is
Yes. Oh my
old.
gosh.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the
I
old thing.
harassed them. That is crazy. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
same. Like that was, my favorite activity. And I like on a very like, juvenile level, I remember thinking like, oh, it'd be amazing if like watching movies could be my homework. And so going to film school like made sense in that way. But it was at NYU that I also think growing up in a city like Hong Kong, which is so stratified, it's a colonial city. It's, filled with inequality, but it's also like incredibly cinematic because it's like the city that's built into a jungle,
Right.
basically a jungle
Right.
island. I think like that just really, I don't know, when I have dreams, they always just, all my dreams mostly take place in Hong Kong and like the street that I grew up on, which is, and so I think when I went to NYU, I was studying screenwriting actually. And it was a required class in documentary that sort of exposed me to the nonfiction mode of filmmaking. And it was in New York that I love animals. So I wanted to make a film about a simple documentary about the Central Park Zoo. And just to look at the phenomenon of like why do we like to stare at animals behind plexiglass and take
Right.
our kids there and what does that mean? And in doing that, a simple, assignment, I discovered that there was this guy called Oda Benga, who was an African human pygmy who was, you know, displayed in the monkey house. Um, and he committed suicide after he was released. And discovering that story that made its way into this short documentary I was making, it had all these themes about colonialism and racism and speciesism that I was so interested in. And just the act of like digging a little bit into the surface of something and discovering this rich depth of history and meaning behind it was such a profound experience for me. I knew I wanted to do that for, the rest of a lot, well, it's been like 15 years now.
Well,
Yeah.
the form, I'm calling it an art form, but the form of documentary is such a long process. You're open to the world, a story comes to you, and then you have to then figure out how you're going to like do all this stuff to like tell this story. And so I'd love to talk about your first film, Stray, because that to me is that literally put you on the map, but also how I discovered you too. I watched this film and I was so fascinated with how you were able to capture this world from a dog's perspective and just kind of and so the patience of it all is really fascinating to me, and that was always something that I kind of admired your work for. And if you can talk a little bit about understanding that like time,
Yeah.
even though it's of course we all like you have to like have the thing must have a beginning middle and end, but the way you allow for these things to kind of like live out the life that it needs to is really patient. And
Thank you. Thank
I
you.
would be like, well, like, oh well,
Yeah.
guess I'm not doing a dog film now, the kind of,
No,
so I'm just curious.
sometimes I always think about like, especially with the Stray film, I'm like, I guess the only thing that separates a non-filmmaker from a filmmaker, like a non-filmmaker or a non-documentarian and a documentarian like myself, is just I was willing to spend the time
Yeah,
stalking these dogs for hours on end and months on end
it's
and was willing to put in that time. And that's the only difference in our skill sets is just the willingness to look. And the camera allows me to do that. It's like this excuse to like slow down. I
yeah,
think what the camera functions for me as I move through the world, we're hurrying through the world constantly in our lives. And I'm not sort of like a person who's like, really meditative or anything like that. But once I have a camera in my hand, I feel myself being transported into a state where I'm suddenly alive to everything that's happening around me because I'm like so hungrily trying to capture it in the frame and waiting for incredible moments to happen spontaneously and through happenstance. And if I'm recording, it just feels like the best feeling. Like I'm just everything is like a bonus from the world. And I do have this belief, like in making Stray, in choosing to make a film like Stray, that stray dogs ostensibly are like the most disposable beings in any urban
Right.
fabric. Like, they can be turned on at any given moment. And, that happened actually in Turkey in the last few years. The government has turned on all its stray dogs and they've, started killing so many of them and impounding them. And what I wanted to do with Stray was that the exercise of looking carefully at what other people may dismiss as, this is not rarefied access. Anyone can have access to stray dogs.
Right.
That that would be meaningful if you just look, that something profound will emerge. And I really found that to be true in the exercise of making Stray. It was like one of the most joyous periods of my life, following these dogs around with no agenda, um, no schedule, and have no idea where the story is going to take me and whether there would be a story at all.
Right.
But that was the freedom that came with the making a project and it being having the naivete of it being my first project, where I really felt it was this great experiment in what does life look like when it's translated through the camera to try to convey a canine experience of the world in terms of time and in subject matter also, and what they're paying attention to in life.
I mean, before I go to Mistress, I need to know, are the dogs okay? Like, like it is,
Yeah.
are we updated with like the livelihood of
Yeah,
our
so
subjects and stuff?
in 20, a few years ago, I discovered that they were about to start mass killing all the dogs. And so I was like, oh my God, I can't let the star of my documentary just die like that. That would be horrific. And so I traveled back to Istanbul and spent a week looking for her.
Mm.
And fortunately, on the last day, I found her, and miraculously. And I was like, okay, got to get you off the streets, even though it was a very bittersweet moment because her life is great. She's free. She
Yeah.
lives on her own terms, but I knew that her days were numbered if I just let her stay there. So I adopted her to this man called Mert Akak, and if you follow him on Instagram, he's got this huge following and he has this animal sanctuary on the outskirts of Istanbul. And so now she lives this life,
Yes.
second chapter of her life in this like forest land, where she has like 20 other former stray dogs who are now her family, with this man who is, the most generous man on earth. And so
I,
she has good twilight years. And
uh,
it's been so long already. It's been like 6 years.
that's so crazy. I'm like sequel. I'm like a follow-up sequel, short film. I'm just gonna throw
Yeah.
that back at. All right. So you spent this period of time, you put out a movie, and then obviously like these lessons that you've learned about like time and watching and observing. How did you then pivot to turning to take a look at China? Because I mean, obviously from Hong Kong, we have a very specific relationship with the big crunchy upstairs, and so was that always a goal of yours to kind of really take a look
Mhm.
and maybe showcase a part of China that a lot of the West don't get to see? And so can you talk a little bit about deciding this and then kind of it's a huge country. There's a lot of stories going on there. There's beautiful stories left, right, and so I'm just like, how did you kind of then find this one in particular was the one that like you really wanted to focus on?
So Stray was such a revelatory experience for me to get to know Turkey, a country I'd never been to prior to making a film there. It showed me a different way of interspecies life that is completely foreign to my Eastern upbringing or my Western, adult life. And so I knew that I wanted my second documentary to take place in China, a place closer to my heritage that was still kind of unknown to me, an unknown quantity, and that was having increasing influence in Hong Kong and inevitably. But I also knew as a filmmaker that I didn't want whatever subject matter I chose in China, I did not want it to be subject matter that would further alienate the West
Hmm.
from China and from Chinese people. And so I wanted to find a subject matter that could really act like a bridge, that anyone who's watching this film, that that the ordinary lives of Chinese people could be showcased, not just people on, not just people who are, battling, well, just ordinary people's lives
Right.
that represent the majority, and that a type of story that would not be able to be weaponized by either the East or the West against each other. And so love felt like the most sort of fitting place to look because also, when I was growing up as a teenager, my going to movie land, I was not, renting documentaries. I was renting, romance films,
Right.
rom-coms like Notting Hill, all the Richard Curtis films, Four Weddings and a Funeral. Those are the films that with Nail and I, all these films are the ones that I grew up on and loved. And I wanted to be able to do that in documentary, even though it's very unordinary to tell a love story in the documentary form. And I didn't necessarily think it was possible, but I started looking into the world. And I had always been interested in this like murky liminal spaces of like private detectives and fortune tellers. And so I was like looking into this world because actually, when I was in high school, I spent a year studying abroad and living abroad in Beijing, where I would always see under sort of the bridges, there would be like these numbers scribbled in chalk under the bridges. And it was like, for private eyes. And I never pursued it, but I always wanted to. And so finally, like, 20 years later, I'm like trying to, I look into this field again. And as I'm sort of researching private detectives and this universe in China, I think that I watched Zhang Yimou's Raise the Red Lantern,
Hmm.
and I'm so struck by the question that it raises about, what is it like to be a woman navigating life, the pressures of life. And, I was in my 30s at the time, and every time I return to Hong Kong, I feel the pressures of society and expectation and timeline, bearing down on me too. So then I thought, maybe it would be really interesting to see what is happening in China today. Like that film took place in 1920s China, what it's like to be a woman, a concubine, or a fourth wife there. So the equivalent today might be a mistress. And so I
Right.
started looking into mistresses in China, and that's how I came upon the mistress dispelling phenomenon.
Which is crazy. I mean, like until I saw your film, it was like, wait, what? This is actually, I mean, I've heard growing up being in Hong Kong, there's a lot of stories, about like this, there's always stories of people you might even know all of a sudden it's like got a mistress, and then so there this culture exists, but like the way you kind of approached it, and then actually I think the magic trick was getting a person like Teacher Wang to kind of like, how did you discover her, and the fact that this service even exists is so
Yeah.
fascinating to me. Can you talk a little bit about kind of like finding this person?
Yeah, so when I discovered the Mistress Dispeller phenomenon, I thought at first this could only be a fiction film because
Yeah.
who is going to
Yeah.
reveal themselves in this way? It should be enshrouded in secrecy and shame. But I met my China-based producer Maggie Lee, who also worked on like the documentary Ascension, through my friend Jessica Kingdon, and I asked her if she could look for real Mistress Dispellers in China. And so on a scouting shoot, we met with dozens of Mistress Dispellers and like love hospitals, different companies offering the service. But Teacher Wang was the only one who, on day one of our scouting trip, was able to get us access to film with a husband, a wife, and a mistress who are at the tail end of a case on camera. And in that afternoon, I saw this man. So, originally my focus was like, what is it like to be a woman, right? And
Right.
look at the structures of love and family from the peripheral gaze of a mistress, in a similar way that I was looking at Turkish society and what was happening in the world at that moment through the peripheral gaze of a stray dog, someone who's transgressive and
Hmm.
considered unimportant. But in that afternoon, I saw this man who was breaking down and crying in front of Teacher Wang in one of his consultations with her. And I just was so moved by that, which was so unexpected for me because I did not expect to be moved by this cheating husband, that I felt like there was a film worth making here where I could help, if I could allow audiences to experience what I experienced, which is your empathy expanding and stretching to places that you didn't expect over the course of 90 minutes, that would be a meaningful exercise in itself in being human, and that this was a perfect container to elicit that and evoke that sort of reaction from audiences. And because Teacher Wang had such close and incredible relationships with her clients, um, and she was able to get people to be on camera, that's when I knew that we had a film.
I was going to ask, how did she get people to go on camera? Because again, this is such an extremely private matter.
Yeah.
These moments exist, and it's so, and a camera obviously will then showcase. I mean, they'll be public then, and then it'll. So what was her tactic of kind of saying like, hey,
Yeah.
like because it's so fascinating. The whole time I was just like, how did you do this? Like, how did you get it? And I think that was kind of like, it's gonna be a lot of my questions, by the way.
So
Like, it's
so
just
much
like,
of it, I think so much of it is a testament to her
yeah,
work and her EQ. So she has hundreds of clients, and out of hundreds of clients, I think maybe a handful of them would agree to be filmed.
right,
And the way that she persuades them is often using the line of, if you are willing to share your story publicly, the pain that you're going through privately in your own home, this will help other people understand how to navigate this kind of crisis
right,
themselves, and that this is an act of acting in the greater good. And so the few clients who, have that kind of impulse and that kind of largesse of generosity in terms of and unself-consciousness, those are the ones who would typically agree. And it would usually be the wives that she starts with. And then the wives sort of convince their husbands, and then the husbands convince their mistresses.
to I'm assuming that initially this must have been a film about multiple stories, and then somehow you decided to focus on one. And I'm just curious, like, what was the kind of decision? What was the point in making this film where you were just like, wait a minute, I think we've got a full beginning, middle, and end here, and we can totally, was there an aha moment that kind of
Yeah.
like happened for you?
So actually, from the beginning of the film, the seed of the idea, it was always the most elegant form that I aspired that the film could take shape would always have been a love triangle, a Rashomon, where you're examining a crumbling love story from
Right,
all three angles of a love triangle. So that was always the most elegant shape that we could hope to achieve. But obviously, in reality, we knew that, could we get access, deep enough access, could the character protagonists be compelling enough to sustain themselves over 90 minutes? Is that enough? So we filmed with so many different cases who are all equally compelling in their own ways. But when we finally, but throughout those 3 years, we never got a full case from beginning, middle to end, and all three parties agreeing to remain featured in the film. And so that was always a struggle. We always had bits and pieces. But finally, when we got to Mr. and Mrs. Lee and Fei Fei, we were able to get that deep level of access because in those 3 years, um, 2 years prior to production, the little brother that's in the film,
right,
he was actually a male mistress that we had filmed with, and he was getting dispelled by Teacher Wang when we had filmed with him. And he maintained a good relationship with Teacher Wang despite being dispelled and finding out her real identity in their life, and had a good experience with us. So 2 years later, when the wife, comes to him with her problem, he offers us as a solution, us and also Teacher Wang. And so that's how we had that pre-existing trust with the wife. And then and then and then the husband and Fei Fei and the mistress were brought on to participate in a film very, very broadly about modern love in China. And that's what they had agreed to at first. And they didn't know how big of a part they were going to play in our film because we had filmed with so many different cases in love industries. And at that point, we didn't know either.
yeah,
So, but my producer, Emma Miller, and I, we knew that by the end, in order to be ethical, we had to, you know, they had to know the full truth of what had happened to them and also what role Teacher Wang played in their lives. And at that point, they would have the opportunity to either drop out or reconsent to being a part of the film. But because we had so much material over these 3 years, we felt perfectly safe that we had this contingency that we could make a survey love film in
right.
China. We always knew, but I will credit it's Charlotte Munch Bengtson, my editor, who also edited All That Breeze and Truffle Hunters and
Mm,
Active Killing, incredible, very experienced editor. She looked at the footage for like a week, all of our footage, and instantly she was like, I have an idea and I hope you don't resist, but this couple, Mr. and Mrs. Lee, they're sacred. And if you try to dilute them with any other couples by juxtaposing them against, both couples will suffer, or all three couples will suffer. So we should just move forward with this couple. And I instantly agreed because it was going back to the seed of the idea that I
yeah.
had from the beginning.
I mean, Mr. Lee. it's just fascinating. Like that, even that opening like dinner, and I'm just like, they're having a meal, and this isn't the beginning of this kind of scenario. And like he just thought he was making a film about love in China. Was that like that's
Yeah.
so crazy.
Yeah.
And
Like domestic life in China.
it's so intimate. The way you kind of like the way you place your cameras is really fascinating too, because you how many cameras were there? Like I literally have this question. I'm like, how many cameras are in this
There's
house?
two. There's two. It was
Just
the most
two?
heavily covered, yeah, domestic
Gosh.
scene.
Because then there's like hallway sequences, there's bedroom sequences. I mean, like this is
People always think that I stage those, but they're not. It's just
yeah.
patience again. It's like if I put myself in a situation and I'm just rolling constantly and being hyper alert to anything that might be interesting, and I'm always lingering longer than you would expect, then something magical tends to happen in the last 10 seconds.
I appreciate because I'm Chinese and Asian in the sense that like so much is around food and like and how really for our people like a lot of stuff happens behind like with a pair of chopsticks and like a bunch of dishes in front of you. And I'm just curious, like, did you notice that? Like literally as the things were kind of like as you're editing this piece together, it's like a lot of your movies, like I got hungry afterwards. And so like I mean I
Yeah, a lot of
shouldn't, but
people.
like but I was just like, oh, I should eat something. Like I was like super psyched about, but can you talk a little bit our relationship with this kind of space where I guess we're sharing a dish, whatever that thing is, but it's almost like a sacred space that allows for people to open up, people to like, it was just fascinating. And I literally wrote like food. Like I was just like, yeah,
No, like every single scene basically unfolds over a tabletop. At either they're in a tea house
yeah,
or in over a meal. And I think that that is just so much a part of the culture in China and that I was filming that it would have been impossible to avoid that. And I think because all of these scenes are so emotionally sort of intense and dialogue heavy, and you have to pay a lot of attention to know what's going on. I wanted the experience to be very central for audiences too. And I think food being a part of their lives, that this texture, this additional texture that they were already, partaking in, that was just, yeah, organic to their setup.
it's genius. What I also appreciate is in between their story, you kind of opened the lens wider in the sense that you showed these services. You had the park where people are kind of parents are putting out all the
Yeah.
all the stuff with their kids. Please marry them, like kind of thing. And it's just this whole like culture of like coupling, and even having conversations where it's like group counseling, where it's just like this is, and I loved how you showcase that because then again, it also allows for people who don't know China to kind of see a side that is like, people are having conversations. It's not, I don't really know, but it was just really fascinating how you allowed for this exterior world to kind of also exist in your film. And was that always something that you wanted to talk about also?
Yeah, I always knew that, aside from the core love story, that I wanted to weave in the macro context in which these love stories are unfolding. Because I do think that the way we behave in the world, all the decisions, subconsciously or consciously, that we make, even in our hearts, that those are shaped by forces that are larger than us,
Yeah,
our upbringing, the environment that we grew up in, the societal expectations, the pressures. And so to physicalize that, I used sort of these vignettes of the parental marriage markets, the telephone marketer company that is saying that, a woman's value goes down as her age goes up. Uh, you know, in the parental marriage market, you see like the man's desirability as a mate is only he's desirable if he has no mortgage, or his desirability is tied to a mortgage. And they're just that when love is so commoditized and forced to operate within the strictures of society, that it's inevitably corrupted. And that hopefully by showing that larger environment in which love is not as simple as just a feeling, that then when you think about, our characters operating within this larger environment, that their choices make more sense, that
right.
you can make the connections yourself. And the reason why I wanted to expand even further back into natural
Yeah,
landscapes that were filmed across national parks in China, um, is to suggest that, like, all these love stories that are unfolding on the land of China, that at the end of the day, nature is both, very indifferent to our petty dramas and our jealousies, but at the same time, Yuval Harari says in his newest book, Nexus, he talks about biodramas and the reason why we love soap operas, which are always full of love triangles and jealousies and succession stories and sibling rivalries, because we evolved from that, like competition over resources
Mm.
and lovers and opportunities for procreation and security was how and competition against your siblings. That's how we've survived. It's in our DNA. And so I wanted to say through those sort of wider natural landscapes, like, we're just animals at a primal level moving through the world, trying to find opportunities to connect and often not able to, and the struggles of that.
When I mean, Fei Fei comes in, who is the mistress herself. She comes in a little bit later in the film, and what I appreciated is immediately was like, oh, there's no judgment on this woman, and she's actually very taken care of in the way you presented her and stuff. And can you talk a little bit? I mean, you mentioned it a little in the beginning of this talk, but like, can you talk a little bit about kind of making the decision? I mean, it's very easy to kind of throw her under the, the bus and just be like, she's the bad one, and like, but you really take care of her. I mean, you give her a soundtrack. I mean, like this whole thing that exists, and it's so. I'm just wondering if, yeah, can you talk a little bit about having her be just as integral to this coupling, this couple that may or may not be breaking up in the
Well,
process.
we always knew that like access to the mistress would be revelatory for audiences and even for us. And that, the point that at which she's revealed in the film, at that point when you middle of the film and you're like, wow, we're also going to see her perspective too, when for the first half of the film, she's just been this phantom threat to the wife, who's not personalized or humanized. Um, Actually, like it was because I went into this with the idea that this would be the Rashomon, so your sympathies would shift.
Yeah.
And also because in practice, Teacher Wang's philosophy and why she's so good at her job is that she says that in the film, like the person who is in the most pain is actually the mistress, because she doesn't feel that she deserves a complete love. So she's actually in a lot of inner turmoil on a fundamental level. And her job as a mistress dispeller is to help her see that she deserves more. And that in doing that, it will dispel her from this extramarital affair. Um, because that's her methodology, we knew that that would be a huge part of the film always, her relationship with the mistress and the mistress's awakening to her own self-worth in order to be able to see whether she still wants to be in a relationship like this. But in terms of production, the point at which the audience meets the mistress in the badminton court is also the point at which we meet the mistress
Hmm.
as a film crew. And I remember thinking she was so young and like beautiful. And as a cinematographer, I was like, oh, I'm so lucky to be able to film, a face like this. And and I remember all of us thought, is she actually a hired actress by the
Oh,
mistress
wow.
dispeller? That she
Yeah.
maybe didn't actually get the access to the mistress, and so she just hired someone but didn't tell us. But then as time wore on, and especially when you get to that breakup scene where she kicks Teacher Wang out of the tea room and then she confronts the husband, it's like, where have you been? How come I haven't seen you? That's the moment where we're like, oh, this is for real. They have this entangled history. There's no denying it. There's no way she's like a D-list actress in the middle of China improvising lines that are like this, because there's real emotion there, no matter how suppressed and muted it is. And I feel like I also wanted audiences to go through that kind of the disbelief where you suspend it over time and then you really believe in the
Hmm.
authenticity of their relationships in these scenes,
What I
which is
pre
what we went through too.
it's what's so fascinating, and I think maybe obviously the camera probably added to the effect. Everybody's so reasonable. Like it was so crazy. And I'm just
I
like,
know.
what the hell?
Yeah,
Like,
okay, yeah, yeah,
okay, yeah, tell me, like, were you expecting things to like amp up? Because it really was this kind of like, I don't know if in a normal situation.
I know. So the Mistress Dispeller, Teacher Wang, told us, she's like, if your cameras weren't here, this the case might have unfolded in the same way, but the way in which people carried themselves and the things that they said would be entirely different. That emotions would be far more heightened. But I think the presence of the cameras really made these participants try to be their best selves because they're very aware that they're being filmed despite the circumstances. But you see, what I find fascinating is that all the footage is basically you seeing them trying to be their best selves, competing with their rawer, darker, baser selves in competition the whole time. It's just the suppression of their real feelings with the image that they want to project and hope to.
I mean, there's a scene where Mrs. Lee literally says, like, I will do stuff if not for the
Yeah.
camera. But actually, that scene in particular is really fascinating because also it's the first time you break the fourth wall. Like, that's the one where you allow for Teacher Wang to look at the camera and just be like, "What's up?" That kind of, And so that can you talk about always having that distance and then breaking it during this one moment, which is really the like
Yeah.
the most. It's the big showdown, And so
Yeah.
that's yeah. Can you talk a little about deciding that that's going to be in
Yeah.
in the camera for that moment?
For sure. Oh, before that, another
Yeah.
point I want to make about like how they appear so dignified. It's partly also because Teacher Wang actually kind of coached them and was like, this film will be consumed in the West. And how do
Oh.
you represent Chinese
Oh
people?
yeah. Oh
And
yeah.
so, so it was
Throw
like,
China culture.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's
So
like
there
you're
was that
representing your
element
people.
too.
You're like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You're representing the people obviously should not fall on them, but
yeah.
that was in their minds as they were behaving their way through this.
That is
But
so funny.
yeah. Okay, so breaking the fourth wall. So that was a discussion that Charlotte, my editor, and I had. And the decision we came to was that for the first three quarters of the film, because we could have broken the fourth wall so many times
Yeah.
throughout the whole movie, but we didn't want to do that at the beginning because we wanted, because we knew that the impossibility of this whole premise as a documentary would be already unfathomable and like people would be very skeptical already. But we didn't want everybody to pay so much attention into how the film was made because we wanted people to be invested in them as characters, as if it's a fiction film where you're invested in character and plot and motivation. And that's how the film is really structured. So you're really getting to know the wife in the first half, and then the husband as much as you can, and then the mistress. And finally, once you're invested in all the characters, by the end, we felt the need to really show you how the sausage was made, to prove that, this was real. These are
Yeah.
real people dealing with cameras being present and a crew being present. Um, and when she breaks the fourth wall, what I love about that scene is that she's like, oh, she's really frazzled. The Teacher Wang's the first time you see her frazzled.
Yeah.
And then she's like, okay. And she tries to coach the wife on what to say. And then the wife goes wildly off script.
Oh, totally.
And I love that contrast of like people's real wills just shining through. And they're so dignified and they're so eloquent in expressing the stages in life that they're in. A young woman um, forging some strange alliance with a woman in her middle age.
I did at the very end. I was just like, I love this film. But what's fascinating is that the way the Mistress Dispeller kind of like lives, like kind of creates it is manipulation in a weird way. And so to me, it feels a little bit like it just, and so was there ever on your end to maybe go into the grayness of this whole thing, or did you want to keep the job a little bit more just this is what she does because you
Mhm.
could that's a whole different story, like that could have turned into a whole different thing too, and backstory, whatever that thing could have existed. And so I'm just curious, like, was there ever a section where you were heading there but then you're like, no, 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 let's come back to the like main source and just
Yeah.
focus on this?
The
Was this
making of Mistress Dispeller could have been like the making of it being embedded. It could have been a very self-reflexive film in
yeah,
which the Mistress Dispeller is such a character to deal with because she is so expert at manipulation and strategizing that could have been a whole other film. And it could have become almost a personal film in which
yeah,
I could become a character too in the whole crew. But I just I didn't have it in me to I did not have the ability to be on camera. So it's just like outside of my temperament to be able to make a film like that. I
yeah.
wish I had that capacity to make a film like that, but I just didn't have it in me. But also like I knew that the story that we wanted to tell was a love story
Yeah.
and that it would be an affirming love story and not an expose on, the darker aspects of the mistress dispelling industry.
Was have you shown this film in China or like, and so, and what has the kind of response been like? Because again, for the West, this is going to be a first time they're seeing a
Mhm.
modern China, because I think there's a lot of this ideal of just like, it's still villages. And I mean, you've got the big cities, obviously they've seen that stuff, but then they think of China as a different kind of
Yeah,
situation. And so I love that this is like not a top tier city. This is literally, it's a, I don't know, but like and it's a
very
city.
connected.
Yeah. And it's something, but it's very modern, and people
Yeah,
live very wonderful lives. And it's just,
yeah.
and so, um, yeah, can you talk a little bit about showing it back to the people that kind of
That was
that you filmed for?
really important to me to show a side of China that is not often represented in the West of modern middle class China, of the majority in a second or third tier city. And what I've been really touched by is that because so the condition upon which these participants agreed to be filmed is that we could never release it publicly in China. So I
Oh,
haven't had the opportunity to show it in China, but when I have shown it in America, a lot of Chinese nationals or diaspora, Chinese diaspora have come up to me afterwards and said, this feels like the most authentic representation of
yeah.
contemporary Chinese life they've seen, and it feels very familiar to them, the way that the parents interact with each other, the way people communicate, and so I am very moved by that and glad that I was able to bring this side of China that's not often been seen to the West, and also for people who are from that region to feel that it is reflective of their reality. Um, and it's interesting the contrast that I see between, so I have shown it privately in Hong Kong uh, and in parts of Asia. And it's interesting the contrast of the audience reaction um, when it comes to the way they communicate, but also the actions that they take. So in Asia, I think there's less surprise about how they behave and the choices that they make in their life. For example, like the husband choosing to stay with his family.
Hmm.
In the West, sometimes I'll get questions like, why did he choose to stay with his family? And whereas in the East, it's a given. And I think that contrast comes from sort of like on a civilizational level, um, with the East being a more collectivist culture in which the sacrifice of your personal happiness for greater good or for the unity of the family is much more expected than in the West, where it's a much more individualistic culture where the pursuit of your own happiness is paramount. And the sacrifices that that entails for the husband to make in the film is much less understandable in the West. And I found that reaction really interesting too.
So
And
you've done two films, and obviously during this whole period of time, probably the seeds of multiple other ideas exist. And I'm just curious, like, are you working on something? And because this film itself is so cinematic that I was just like, oh, she can do narrative if she wants to. And I'm just curious, like, is that, I don't know, like,
yeah,
where do you kind of are you kind of leaning towards moving forward from a project like
yeah,
this? Well, again, and you've learned so much from Stray. You've learned so much from this film now. You have this like new like kind of set of skills that you can really take onto the next one. I'm just curious, like, what does that look like for the next project
yeah.
that you're
I would
working on?
love for my next project to be a narrative film and to flex a different creative muscle than the one that I have been using with observational documentary. And I would love to, yeah, I would love to be able to explore that. And that's what I'm trying to work on now.
I see it happening. I'm putting it out there in the universe for you. It's gonna
Thank
happen.
you.
So lovely to talk to you, and this film is a real wonderful piece of art, and then, like, I appreciate it so much, and so thank you for making it, and congrats on just putting it out there for all of us to be able to see.
Thank you for your wonderful questions.
No,
Please let me know when you come to Hong Kong and we can hang out there.
yeah, we will do something. Thank you so
Yeah.
much. Nice talking to you.